welcome to our panel, Balancing the Supply Chain Act. We promised you some answers to important questions, so although we can't solve all that problems in the next 40 minutes, we will bring some very interesting perspectives together. So in the next 30 minutes, we discuss here in the panel, and the last 10 minutes, I would like to get your questions and thoughts and everything about that. So my name is Melanie Wollnik. Actually, I'm in a leadership role at DB, and I'm also in a facilitation role at the Open Rail Association. So now you know who I am, and I think you are eager to get to know the panelists, and so I will start. Please introduce yourself and maybe just give us a short introduction what your perspective on the supply chain is.
Sure. I'm Tim Schmetzer. I'm a lawyer and associate at Osborne & Clarke, specializing in regulatory, mainly AI regulatory and cyber resilience and software law. So obviously my take on this topic would be what legal requirements do we have when managing an open source supply chain, and also what can be pragmatical but at the same time diligent approaches to manage such challenges.
Yeah, my name is Cornelius Schumacher. I'm working at DB Systel as open source steward, so taking care of open source at Deutsche Bahn. I resonate with the pragmatic approach. Those of you who were in my talk before, together with Max, my colleague there, we told you a little bit about how Deutsche Bahn is approaching the supply chain, the software supply chain, the open source software supply chain. And my main perspective there is that we are consuming a lot of open source software, but we are not primarily selling a product based on software. So the implications are maybe a little bit different than from other perspectives.
Thank you.
Yeah, warm welcome from my side. I'm Sven Jeroschewski, software engineer with the Osborne ISPO. It's the Robert Bosch GmbH, or Robert Bosch. Yes, the Bosch with the rolling tools or the washing machines, or also a lot of car parts. So in that regard, we a bit similar to what DB is doing, with also offering a lot of services which are not around software, especially hardware, but also doing a lot of software on top of that. But that's what I can bring in here.
I'm Sarah Hoffmann. I'm an open source developer. I maintain a couple of projects for the OpenStreetMap project. So I am here as a part of the community and as one of these many maintainers, where you have one or two people looking after the open source software used by companies, which kind of was accidental to us. So the supply chain for us is not so much a legal or risk requirement, but first of all, something we suddenly are asked to do. So how we can balance this is the question I'm going to answer.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks for your introduction. So now we have heard a little bit about the different perspectives we would like to talk about today. We have the organization perspective on two sides, the community perspective, the regulation perspective. So the question I have for you, maybe the same way. So where do you expect clashes or tensions between the different views or the different needs we would like to talk about?
So from a legal perspective, when looking at how to manage an open source supply chain, I think we should bear two things in mind. Now, the European and the German supply chain acts both come more from an ESG perspective, which is usually not the main challenges we face when talking about open source supply chains, but the topic's much older. So this is mainly existing regulations such as copyright, as we know, and the other part would be making it a bit more complex, new regulations such as the AI Act and Cyber Resilience Act as well. And the other topic we should bear in mind when talking about open source supply chains would be that we usually have a bit of a different structure to the supply chains than we do in actual product-specific supply chains. When I take, for example, a gear or, I don't know, a circuit, I usually have several different actors on a chain, and the part comes from one part to the next step or link in the chain. at open source, we have a bit of a different structure. I would call it probably a supply sun, since if I take like 3 or 4 different open source components, I do not get my licenses usually from the next link in the chain, but always from the original licensor of the open source products. So we have different licensing suns that I need to bear in mind, and also different licensors, and I do have to bear in mind different actors and more of them, which makes it probably a tad more complicated to have an overview of your supply chain than it would be in an actual product, in a physical product.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what's your...
For me, this this breadth of projects and the sheer number of projects, of course, is a real challenge. But I think I would summarize it as expectations. Expectations differ quite a bit. And a company has expectations how software is made, how supply chain is managed. Sometimes they are forced to do things a certain way because of regulation, or it's just company procedure or industry processes or whatever. So expectations, what can we expect from a software vendor, are transferred to what could we expect from the software community, and that's often nothing which is even a term in the processes. So there are other like life cycle. For us, in our case, we have a lot of products and projects which run for a long time. So what happens if we expect software to be maintained for 20 years? Who can actually do that? Can a community do that? In many cases, they actually can do that, but how are these expectations then expressed and negotiated? And how can we get more reliability on what we expect from one side or the other side? And how can we get actually in a conversation about that? Even that sometimes is difficult. Also the scale again, I'm sometimes sad when I talk to open source projects that who ask for support, for example, for a conference or something, and say, okay, personally, I find that very interesting and you're doing great work, but if I talk to 100,000 open source projects, I can't sponsor 100,000 conferences. So and this then sometimes leads to we are not sponsoring any conference. So I would really like to find a better way how we can kind of match the expectations, match also the culture, match how we work together in a way that we all benefit, because in the end we are part of one ecosystem.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just second what Cornelius just said, because maybe from the other side also for the people in the companies, because I think there's also kind of a learning curve in the sense that they know how to treat suppliers. I'm not always saying that it's in a good way, but they know that. And if they now try to adopt the same principles to treating open source maintainers the same way, this will definitely clash. And I think that's also a learning curve. It has to happen at some point, how to deal with that, because at some point, obviously there are requirements towards the software, but also these requirements are more relevant for the people adopting that software. I think that's what the Tim just outlined. So the question now is, how can we get into that part of communication? That's from the cultural side, on both sides, but also what is actually helpful for the maintainers or the open source communities? Because just going there and writing an email, you have to fix that within tomorrow. I guess it's not helpful and not appreciated, and might even lead into the other direction. So if you think about the talks that, for instance, Daniel Steinberg is giving about all the emails that he got after some of the Log4j incidents, where he had to basically prove that he's not using Log4j, I think that kind of tells you a story like what has to be done also for some of the corporates. But at the same time, the question is, what is actually helpful for the maintainers? And I think that's a discussion that we can also have here in the panel, and it also will, I think, have quite some involvement in the upcoming years when there are also more requirements like the CIA on the corporate side to look into those kind of things. And maybe to say one thing ahead, I'm not sure that money will solve all the problems here. It's more the question of distributing the money and also using it in an impactful way instead of, let's say, a lot of, you just mentioned the problem of, okay, I have to fund 100 companies. If you now look into all of your SBOMs, I would expect that a lot of companies find the same maybe 10 to 30 projects in their SBOM. And even though it might be very good for these kind of projects that all the companies now try to look into that, it's not really helpful for the overall ecosystem because you have a lot of projects that might also need consideration, but are a bit beyond the main focus here. So that's also, again, a distribution problem that we might face here.
Okay, Sarah.
Yeah, so if you look this from the point of the open source community, if you think about how the open source community came to be, so originally it was a group of enthusiasts, technical enthusiasts who wanted to solve technical problems. And with open source, we basically created the perfect way of doing exactly that with eliminating all the overhead. So we really do the coding, and we say we put the code out in the open because we don't want to care about licensing and restricting access. That's actually work. And even communication. We communicate by just sharing code. That's enough. And the interesting thing about supply chain here is it brings back what we try to eliminate. And that means the open source community, to actually do this, has to find another model. On the positive side, I mean, it was kind of accidental that our software got used, but of course it's wonderful, and we are all really happy that, I mean, it's a recognition. And it gives us the opportunity to actually say, hey, we can do this now for a living, we can do this 100%. And I think this is the part where we can actually find a way to work together and find a model where maybe we can retain the model we had with this very efficient collaboration in creating software, while at the same time giving people a way to actually do this 100%. What they're really good at. What they're really good at is coding, and not so much so commercializing, making a profit from it. That's not the interest of the community, and I think this is sometimes where the misunderstanding happens.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. We heard a lot about, I don't know, tensions and different needs. So maybe we turn a little bit to what is your experience from maybe some good practices from your organizations or from your work, where we can build bridges to towards this, I don't know, needs or tensions that arise. Who would like to start?
I actually would have a question there, because Sarah, what you said, I think is a very important point, that open source communities are successful because they eliminated all this overhead, and that's something which even would be useful for companies. I mean, companies would often like to have less overhead, and they are trying to fight that, but in a corporation it's much harder than in an open source community. So we are thinking of that then in these terms, and if we're even talking about the term supply chain and supplier, this is of course a certain framework of thinking, and I'm wondering how do you feel about the term supplier? Is that something where I say, okay, go away, I'm not a supplier, I'm community here, or is that something which even could resonate and say, okay, this is maybe a role an open source community could also take?
That's an interesting question, as I'm also a freelancer. So basically, as an open source community member, I really shy away from the word supplier. But as somebody who wants to make a living out of this, of course, then I also see the way that there are customers, and then basically I do supply something, and I don't want to just be paid. I really want to give value back in this sense. What I'm thinking is maybe we are looking a little bit in the wrong way on this. We are thinking about, okay, open source is a supplier, you're the customer. Maybe there are other models to look at this. One thing, for example, is think about research. Researchers are very similar to open source developers. They just want to solve interesting problem and be please left alone about making money out of it. And we've developed this wonderful system with university, which are financed with public money, which basically give researchers some money so they can pay their rent. And they give them infrastructure. The second part is really important. So they give them infrastructure, and they give them a way to apply for grants, for example, so to get the money, to have a little bit of competitions. And they give the companies the way to also invest their money into research, and then to transfer it back to the company's needs, which in this case would be the supply chain here to really put on top all the legal requirements you have to really use then the outcome. So yeah, maybe we have to have another model here.
While I like the idea, I have maybe a question to that, because looking into the university system and speaking to especially younger researchers, I sense there's always like this hunt for a new grant, a new thing. I always feel bad to say that, but it felt a bit like in one another conference, someone compared this to a drug dealer, where you like always hunt for the next thing to keep going here, and it's a bit different there. So I'm wondering whether this is really helpful in a sustainable and long run to always put the developers or maintainers in a position where they have to hunt for the next grant or also have to hope for that grant. I know that it's more helpful than not getting any money, but I'm wondering how this relates there, especially for infrastructure.
And also vielleicht maybe another take on this. I think we already have some kind of overhead also in the open source community. I find it really interesting point that you said the open source community got rid of an overhead, and I think that's totally true for within open source ecosystems. But given the variety of open source licenses that are out there, and also different FAQs of every different foundation maintaining such licenses, it's a whole different, let's say, overhead ecosystem. And I think maybe that's also the solution to face new challenges of new regulations that affect the supply chain, that the open source community is already working together to manage effectively using copyright. I mean, what the open source community basically invented was using the copyright in a reverse way to protect the openness of software, which is an amazing thought. And to make this work, there has been implemented a seamless overhead that works like itself, like a well-oiled gear. And I think that is maybe also the approach on how to use that momentum that we already have in the community to face new challenges when it comes to cybersecurity or AI governance.
I had the feeling that you just wanted to add something before, or
maybe shortly coming back to the university. So I think you can't do without a little bit of competition. You can't just give. We always have the problem, who do we give the money to? So I think the grant stuff will always be there. It is at the moment the same thing, right? As a freelancer, open source developer, I go from year to year. And with the university system, at some point you have professors. So if you are good enough, then you come to a place where, you have basically an outcome for life and you can basically do what you want. So basically the same thing for open source. You have a couple of maintainers, who have been working well for years, have been looking after the community. So at some point you can say, okay, these are our professors, and we do this in a bit more sustainable way.
And just to clarify, in general, I like the idea of having these grants. I'm also a big fan of these efforts to have something like the Sovereign Tech Agency on European level. So I think it would go a bit in that direction. I was just concerned that it's maybe not this fully sustainable solution to the whole problem.
So money helps, but it's not not the.
And again, the distribution is, I guess, the major challenge here. Not a problem, but a challenge at least.
Yeah. Okay. So Cornelius, what about your question? Are you?
Yeah. One more thought on that, actually. I think the question of competition is quite interesting because in the end, open source is a pretty brutal environment in terms of competition, because you have the whole world competing with you, and the barrier of entry is so low. I mean, we see that. I mean, there are tons of open source projects which are competing with each other, and they are also competing with the attention of people who have money, or companies who use it. So I would even say, I mean, in the open source world, sometimes competition is bigger or stricter or harder than in the corporate world, where you have these structures and you have, I don't know, a long-term contract and you can rely on things. So I'm kind of wondering how this will also develop in in the context of the Cyber Resilience Act, maybe you can also shed some light on that. One dynamic which I see there, if you put more pressure on both the community and the companies, I mean, the system will somehow adapt to this pressure. And will this lead to more openness, that people share things like security attestations or something, and the whole ecosystem grows? Or will that lead to more silos where suddenly people fight about things they actually should work together? It's hard to predict for me.
I think there's two interesting points about that. When talking about competition, I think naturally in the future, whether a project is diligent and diligently working with all the different regulation acts that we have out there, for example, Cyber Resilience Act, for example, the AI Act, for example, NIS2, whatever, will be a competition advantage when thinking about whether or not a product is used in commercial products as well, which also increases an impact of an open source product, although it is not intentionally meant to be commercialized in the first place. And the other interesting point I find about that is that the Cyber Resilience Act unfortunately does not lower the level of complexity that we have in this discussion, because I don't know if you know this, but the European Union, for whatever reason, decided to create their own definition of open source software to make some leeway and some exceptions from this very high level of cyber resilience obligations that are regulated in the CRA. And I believe that the European Union, unfortunately, understood the definition a bit wrong and understood free and open source software to be as in free beer, not as in free speech. And so we have this restriction that only such open source projects largely profit from the exceptions that are not mainly intended to be commercialized, which is, if you look at, I don't know, if you look at an MIT project, or even if you look at most GPL projects, it's just not a realistic approach, since most of the projects somehow must get funding and somehow must compete in an economic world and also gain some level of impact also in commercialized products. So for most of the important projects, the exceptions won't be granted.
Okay, so that's a new challenge.
Exactly. I mean, now you have this additional level of cybersecurity obligations that most projects need to fulfill, and who's going to manage that? I mean, who, if not the community, works together and also uses the impact that we already have, the momentum that we have, the level of collaboration that we already have, to get this together.
Yeah.
Sorry? I mean, we're trying to, and I think I'm pretty confident that the open source community is also lobbying for that to be fixed. There are unfortunately 2 or 3 different open source definitions out there by the European Union. You can thank directly to Brussels, write a letter to the Commission, or I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure how much will happen there. We of course have deregulation approaches in the world, like the Omnibus Act. I don't think it's top priority to fix the open source definitions, but it would be ultimately the goal to leave this, to not over-regulate this well-working ecosystems and challenging them with approaches that were mainly meant for I don't know, top-level commercial projects.
Okay, but yeah, let's a little bit come back to the bringing together of the different tensions we have here, or the different interests we have from the different perspectives. And I would be interested in your I don't know, experiences maybe, or ideas how to bring things together, and maybe from your perspective, from the organization's perspective.
I think we have. I can maybe share 2 stories here that could be fit to that. So one is, I just mentioned the distribution problem. I think one question is like also to figure out, okay, which community is, let's say, in the need of the most support at the moment, or is struggling the most in somehow. So we currently also doing some research on the question on how to identify those projects out of all these. It's kind of finding the needles in the haystack, kind of in the data. So we also will share a bit on that later, but if you have any interest in that, we're happy to discuss that. I know there's a chaos community working on those kind of topics, but we also look into more the data analytics side of these things. Another thing, and you pointed it out quite importantly, is I think the people that started open source projects, they didn't start open source projects because they're so fond of doing compliance and tracking infrastructure, because they actually like to work with the technology. So in the sense of keep the coders coding, I think the most precious resources these people in the communities have is time. So obviously money is a good way to buy the time or free up that time, but in the end of the day, I think what helps a lot is ways to increase their time to actually put effort in what they love doing, working on these projects or other things beyond that. Long story short, I think what could also have a huge impact is to provide more tooling and infrastructure that helps in solving some of these requirements that maybe come up more from a commercial player compared to what you have in the open source side. So as easy as it gets, like maybe you just install a tool with 1 or 2 clicks in a pipeline or something, and you do a lot of these things that are already helpful for the adapters. I think that could be a good approach. So with the Eclipse Apo Apps project, we had one example going in that direction, which is also luckily funded by, or to some degree funded by the European money, but also with money from or developers from Bosch and startups, or one startup, shout out to Double Open here. I think that could be also a good approach to free up some of this essential resource, being the time that you actually spend on the project.
Okay, thank you. So what's the view of the others? Maybe Sarah?
So from the open source side, one of the difficulties with these additional responsibilities you get through the Supply Chain Act is, so as a lone coder, I just code, right? That's the most efficient thing I can do. Now, we've talked a lot about building up a community, increasing it. And so suddenly there's a lot of my time spent in just communication with people, onboarding, looking at PRs. Also, when companies say, oh, we want to contribute, suddenly this is work for me because I have to look at these PRs. So I think there's not enough awareness yet about these additional tasks, which also we somehow have to find time for and hopefully would be paid for. So I was lucky enough by the Sovereign Tech Agency to be selected as one of the maintenance fellows last year. And this was a really good project because it really said, okay, yeah, you're paid exactly for this. If you answer an issue, that's the time there. And I think programs like this, where you can really say, yeah, the overhead, that's finally where it gets paid. This will help a lot.
Okay, something to add?
Yeah, maybe also standardizing and like creating best practices so that individual people can create a level of awareness that makes it less difficult for some people managing positions of projects to take care of all of this, because the more effort anyone who is involved in open source coding gets into being diligent with regard to the different obligations that are in the supply chain or supply sun, would reduce the effort that the project maintainers have. And also, I see that the foundations managing ecosystems probably would have or will probably get a bigger role in this issue, which is also a bit what was intended by the Cyber Resilience Act as well, because the open source stewards, as they're called in the Cyber Resilience Act, they do have a bit more leeway when it comes to how they act and how much they need to take care of.
Okay. So I learned that we have left 10 minutes, and we wanted to talk to the audience. We have one first question.
Well, let's see if it turns out into a question or if it's a command. So I totally dig this open source, like put the overhead away, and people are happy with that. And I want to comment on this, and maybe with the supply chain approach from the supply chain, they should take a little bit of that back. I want to add there, and if they want to, for whatever reason, if they want to make a living out of it or whatever, I think it's perfectly fine for an open source project to say, I don't care. And this is we need where we need to handle this situation also, because for them it's perfectly fine, and of course the supply chain has interest to like have their expectations met, and yeah, this is I think also one of the problem which needs a solution. Tooling might help there also. I agree with that.
So would like to answer somebody of the round?
I mean, I get the approach if you're not like situated in the European Union, so most of the more complicated acts don't apply to you. But I'm not entirely sure if this would be maybe again then a competition issue, because I don't know. I'm pretty sure that projects who are well maintained and have well documentation for companies to work with, so they don't have this huge overhead on their side dealing with all the requirements that are out there. You can discuss that they are a pain to implement, but they are there. So I'm not entirely sure if this is a competition disadvantage for such projects that say I don't care, and if it's not more of an effort that the whole community should take to get an overall well-maintained environment and ecosystem, so everyone could profit from the best practices that are already out there.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, thanks for the interesting discussion. My point is, I think we as companies, or I represent the company, of course, we have to make ourselves aware that we get stuff for free, and the communities out there have not chosen that we pick their stuff. And therefore it's our obligation to actually work with them and not theirs. And that's where my question is coming from. How do you make your company aware what open source is? Because we know that here, but the people in our procurement, in maybe some even of our devs, they don't know how open source works sometimes. And how do you make them aware how the supply chain works in this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think organizational, maybe you too.
I think there are two parts to that. Making people aware of how open source works and kind of getting the positive effects and how this could help a company, how communities work and help and so on. I mean, this is very hard because that means explaining something which is alien to the company, which is not in their DNA. So this takes, I think, a lot of time and patience. For other things, like in terms of what can we actually request from an open source maintainer, there we are much more in the area of what companies are used to do, like, I mean, dealing with regulation, conforming to processes and so on. And there it can be quite easy actually to say, okay, we don't have a contract with this person, so we don't have a way to ask anything, so let's just not do that. So I think that's more easy. That's more about what I sometimes see, that there are really misconceptions where I thought, okay, they would have been clarified 10 years ago already for all the world, and they still come up. So, and that's again an explaining part where you have to explain people what open source is. But I think with these new obligations we have with the CIA and so on, I think companies are actually, from my point of view, at least well prepared to deal with that in a way which is also compatible with the open source world. We just have to be serious about it and be trustful to each other and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Sven?
Yeah, so I feel like I was also addressed with the question, so maybe. I think one thing that is maybe not the best practice, but helps us a lot, is transparency in any degree. Like actually make transparent to whoever's in the organization that you rely on these things, because since it's so easy to consume all these open source, especially if you talk about infrastructure and packages, I think having this transparency helps a lot. And that's also kind of where we want to look into when we do the analysis of the projects there, to have more transparency that there are actually people and organizations behind that, and not just code popping up out of the internet. That's maybe one thing. I think to the transparency, what also pays in is basically training, and not just for developers, but for part of the organization. So I think that's a huge task for each of these organizations on their own. I think that's also one of the reasons why we see so many OSPOs popping up, at least in different places in the organization. I think that's one or two of these things that work out. I had a third point, but yeah, it's maybe we can connect afterwards.
Okay, thank you too. So we have just a few minutes left. I would like to round up the discussion a little bit, maybe in the other direction we start here. So maybe one last sentence, what you take with you from the discussion today.
So yeah, I think we have a long way to go, especially bringing the two worlds together and understanding. I think especially communication. We're still not. It was interesting to talk to all the OSPOs here because there's a completely different level of communication, of a way we talk about the problem, and I think we need to keep going. Yeah.
More communication. Okay, thank you, Sarah. Sven.
I think communication kind of summarizes also what I take away, but also communicate about coordination, because I think what I really liked when you said even accepting an external pull request from another developer is time for you and takes effort. And I think that's also what I'm a bit afraid of, that we might end up in a situation where a lot of projects get not overrun, but get a lot of PRs and maybe others not, and that also the level of communication where someone needs this communication also to coordinate a bit in the ecosystem.
Okay, thank you. Communication.
For me, one very important aspect is we need high-quality open source projects more than ever, and we really have to make sure that this doesn't get lost. And this is work on the sides of the community, this is work on the side of the companies, but we have to make sure that open source software provides building blocks our IT infrastructure can rely on. We have a lot of critical production systems which run on open source, everything. I mean, the society wouldn't work without open source anymore because it doesn't work without software anymore. So we need to take care of this and not let it overrun from developments which undermine open source projects. And this will take maybe some pain on all sides here and there, but I think we have to get through that to get to this constructive zone of collaboration where we can provide this IT infrastructure we need and be in control of it because it's open source.
Okay, thank you. Tim?
I think my take from this discussion was that everyone needs to commit to making this work, and everyone needs to take their part. We already have brilliant open source projects out there that are completely safety certified, or in line with ISO certifications and so on. So I think if everyone commits to making this work from the industry as well as from the open source community, we can go a long way.
Okay, great. So I think time is over. Thank you for your time. We appreciated it very much. Thank you for your questions, and have a nice evening. Afternoon and evening.